taxes to be deducted at source, any payment that you're making to a person who is letting you use any land, building, furniture, fitting, equipment, at that time when the rent is adjusted, then the liability of TDS will arise. The benefit the government is giving me here is Hello everyone, this is CA Rishita Das, and today we are coming up with a new series of income tax, and we are starting off with taxes deducted at source. Now, whenever we are coming to taxes deducted at source, first let's understand what do we mean by taxes deducted at source, or TDS. Let's take an example. I've taken a property on rent and I'm making a series of rental payments to my landlord on a monthly basis. And let's say I'm making a payment of 75,000 per month, and that is the income that is being accrued to my landlord every month. Now the government steps in here and says that, Rishita, please deduct taxes on behalf of your landlord and pay to the government. So this is where the concept of TDS comes in, where the person who's making the payment will be liable to deduct taxes on behalf of the person who is actually in receipt of the incomes. Now, first, today's topic is 194I. 194I is the section which will tell us the provisions regarding taxes to be deducted at source on incomes pertaining to rent. So who will deduct tax at source under section 194I? Any person who is making a payment of rent to a resident is liable to deduct TDS under section 194. When will he deduct? What is the limit for which TDS is applicable? यहाँ पे एक चेंज हुआ है बजट 2025. बजट 2025 के पहले till 31st March 2025, the limit for deduction of TDS was if you are making a payment of more than 2.4 lakh rupees per annum, you are liable to deduct TDS. From 1st April 2025, the limit of deduction has been increased. That is, if you are making a payment of more than 50,000 rupees per month to your landlord, you are liable to deduct TDS on his behalf. Now, what is the rate for deduction? There are two rates here. First is for plant and machinery hire, the rate of TDS is 2%, and for land, building and furniture, the rate is 10%. Now, let me introduce another section 206AA, wherein if the landlord is not furnishing his PAN to you, that is to the deductor, then you are liable to deduct TDS at the rate of 20%. That is the highest rate of deduction of TDS, 20% if he is not furnished his PAN. So we have three rates, majorly two rates, 2% for plant and machinery, 10% for land, building and furniture, and 20% if he is not furnishing his PAN to you. When to deduct TDS or when the liability arises? Every time you are crediting the amount to the payee, or you're making payment in cash or issuing a check, at that time your liability to deduct TDS arises. So liability has arisen. Now when do you submit this amount to the government? You submit this amount on or before the 7th of the next month in which the liability has arisen. So suppose you're making payment for the month of May, your liability to deduct and pay this TDS on the amount of rent that you have paid for the month of May by 7th of June. So these are the provisions of section 194I. Now, like I have said, that every time you are crediting to the account of the payee or you're making a payment, that means advance payment of rent is also covered under the ambit of deduction of TDS. So whenever I'm making an advance payment of rent, I have to deduct TDS. But यहाँ पे I want to introduce another topic. There's a case where let's say you have gone to your landlord and he's saying you have to pay 3 months rent in advance as a security deposit. So that security deposit is refundable at the end of the rent period. In that case, if it is refundable, then TDS liability will not arise at the time of making the payment of refundable security deposit. However, let's say at the end of the term of lease, he has said, okay, let me adjust the last 2 months rent with the security deposit. So at that time when the rent is adjusted, then the liability of TDS will arise on that amount. TDS is now deposited, let's say by the 7th of the next month. There is another compliance that has to be made, that is a quarterly compliance for payments made to residents in Form 26Q. For every quarter, a return in Form 26Q has to be submitted if you are falling under the provisions of 194I. Now let's say I am a practitioner and an individual who is subject to tax audit. If say my gross receipts in a previous year is 40 lakh rupees, the benefit the government is giving me here is they have introduced another section, that is section 194IB. 194IB is applicable for individuals or HUF who are not covered under tax audit. For those individuals and HUF, if they are paying rent to any resident, they will be covered under section 194IB, wherein any payments more than 50,000 rupees per month, which is the same limit as section 194I, they will have to deduct TDS at the rate of 2%. Now here there has been an amendment in Finance Act 2024. Till 30th September 2024, the rate was 5%. So any payment which was made more than 50,000 per month by any individual or HUF who is not falling under tax audit, those payments of rent would have been liable to be deducted as taxes at source at the rate of 5%. But with effect from 1st October 2024, the rate has decreased to 2%. So 2% of such rent, you are liable to deduct TDS. So what the benefit the government is giving us is that first of all, the rate is lower, and also the compliances are reduced. How? Under 194IB, the compliance has to be made only once in a year. So when does the liability for TDS arise? The liability arises at the month in which you are making the last payment during the entire year. Let's say you are having a continuing rent agreement. So the liability for financial year 2024-2025 will arise when you're making the payment for March 2025. So the liability will arise in March, and the compliance has to be made within 30 days. So 30 days means 30th April. And यहाँ पे only one form has to be filed, no quarterly returns, and one form has to be filed, which is a challan cum form 26QC. Now what if under section 194IB, like I said, the liability will arise at the time of credit of rent during the last month of the previous year. Now if your tenancy agreement comes to an end during a year, so if in that case, suppose your tenancy agreement comes to an end in September. So September, at the time of credit of your rent or for the month of September, that will be the time when the liability of the deduction of TDS will arise. So यहाँ पे September का liability, that means within 30th October, you have to make the necessary compliances under section 194IB. In these two sections that we have covered, that is section 194I and 194IB, we are talking about TDS on payments on account of rent. Now, what is rent? Rent has been defined under the provisions of 194I, wherein rent is any payment which has been made under a contract of lease, sublease, tenancy, or any other such agreement for the use of land, building, land appurtenant to building, furniture, fittings, and equipment. So here you can see that the payment which is made need not be a payment to the owner of the property. Any payment that you're making for the use of this, that's the most important thing. Any payment that you're making to a person who is letting you use any land, building, furniture, fitting, equipment, that is considered as rent. So subleasing, subletting, subtenancy, all these are covered under the provisions of TDS on rent. If you have noticed, I have been speaking about payments made to residents. Now what if I am making payment to a non-resident? That is, I have taken a land or building on rent and my landlord or the person who is in receipt of the income is an NRI. In that case, the provisions of section 195 will be attracted, wherein the effective rate of TDS deduction is 31.2%, that is 30% plus surcharge and education cess. So that is 31.2%. Now I am deducting TDS, let's say on behalf of NRI at 31.2%, or maybe on behalf of a resident at 10% for land building, and the resident or NRI is not liable to pay taxes on his total income for entire year under such rates of maybe 10% or 31.2%, then what he can do is either he can file his income tax return accordingly, and if there arises a refund, then he'll apply for that refund and receive the refund accordingly. Or what he can do is he can apply for lower or no deduction of taxes at source under section 197 of the Income Tax Act 1961. So what he can do under section 197 is he can apply to the jurisdictional assessing officer requesting for a certificate for no deduction or lower deduction of taxes. Now, if he furnishes that certificate to you, to the deductor, then he will be liable for deduction at a lower rate or no deduction if that's the case. Now let's come to compliances. Like I've already mentioned, the compliances for section 194 IB, that is for individuals not subject to tax audit. For those individuals and HUFs, provisions relating to compliances only once during a year, that is on or before 30th April for every year under Form 26QC. For others, it is a quarterly compliance. If it is for residents, then quarterly compliance will be in Form 26Q. And if it is towards NRIs, then Form 27Q has to be filed. Now, in conclusion, since we are in the month of April right now, let's sum up what are the compliances that need to be done by this month. So within 30th April, if you are liable for deduction of TDS under section 194 IB, then by 30th April, we need to process the form 26QC. If it is under section 194I, then the deduction and payment of TDS has to be made for the month of March 2025 by 30th April. I hope I could give you a little insight into how TDS works for payment on account of rent. If you have any questions regarding this, please feel free to comment down below. And if you want any other topics to be discussed, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. See you next time.